and welcome again to this seminar. I'm about to open the second panel discussions, which in a way will follow the last part of the discussions we had regarding the language, because most of the time, and I have to say that I did not ask questions because I knew that I was about to be here, but thanks to the space for transition, I can tell you that language is not, of course, neither Portuguese, French, English. There are also other forms of language, especially today in the digitalization moment we are living, facing actually a language that we do not understand, not yet, and facing this darkness, this impossibility to understand how to deal with this artificial intelligence unknown, this sort of non-savoir, like Jacques Lacan used to say. So the language will be at some point the spectrum floating above our head in these panel discussions that we have entitled with Anna, Necropolitics and Racialized Sciences. For this panel, we're going to have 3 lectures presented by my co-panelists here, Ciraj, Rassool, and Marina Gržinić. Am I pronouncing correctly? Thank you. So, Ciraj Rassool, who will start, directs the African program in Museum and Heritage Studies managed by the University of Western Cape, Belleville, South Africa, in partnership with Robert Island Museum. He is a trustee and of the District 6 Museum. I think there is a mistake here. 6 Museum and the South African History Archive. He has been a member of the Archaeology, Paleontology, Meteorites, Heritage Object and Burial Sites Permit Committee of Sahara, and also serves on its Artworks Advisory Panel. Most recently, he was appointed to the Human Remains Repatriation Advisory Committee of the Department of Art and Culture. He has written widely on public history, visual history, and resistance historiography, and has published in the Journal of African History, the Journal of Southern African Studies, Cahiers d'études africaines, African Studies, the South African Review of Sociology, and Chronos, Southern African Histories. Ciraj, you have the mic.
Thank you very much, Kader. Thanks to you, to Anna, to Gerhard for bringing me here into Vienna, which has been a troubling place for us because of histories of human remains collecting in southern Africa that involve cultural institutions in Vienna. But my starting point is one of the central exhibitions in the debate on museum transformation in South Africa during the transition to democracy, in which a major question for us was, how do you remake an old colonial museum into one that is appropriate for a democratic society? How do you turn a museum whose entire ethos was to construct a colonial victimhood through certain discourses of race and tribe, and to place those into a broader framework of natural history, to turn such a museum into a democratic museum? And one of the key tropes of the museum in South Africa was this exhibition, simply referred to as the diorama, but which was created in 1959, 1960, in order to depict an early 19th century, late 18th century hunter-gatherer camp in the Karoo. And it is the work of the meeting of social anthropology and physical anthropology. What's interesting here is you have these two disciplines existing together in the same exhibition, because these are not just figures or models that are in this display. This diorama was created out of body casts that were made by James Drury and the then director of the South African Museum, Louis Perringay, at the turn of the 20th century, between about 1907, 1924, from the bodies of farm workers and shepherds, in order to go about the work of preserving the racial features of the body of people who were deemed to be disappearing racial types. And in doing this, they followed the urging of the anthropologist Alfred Court Haddon in 1905, who urged the South Africans to go about this work of preservation of what was referred to as fast disappearing races. And so this exhibition was a major site of contestation. And the casts contained therein have also been a major site of contestation. And those of you who know about South African art history and about museum history more widely, you will know about a famous exhibition that took place in 1996, curated by the artist Pippa Scottness, which sought to interrogate caste making and to think about the ways in which Khoisan people experienced the violence of the gun and the violence of the museum. Like other exhibitions in different parts of the world, such as the Into the Heart of Africa exhibition in Toronto, in many ways that exhibition was a failed exhibition because it was interpreted to repeat the violence of the museum. So a colleague and I, now late colleague, Martin Legassic, and I wrote a book about this problem. And in so doing, we also wanted to explain how the ideas that went into this display were very much part of what scholars have called the fossil complex in South Africa, in which we try to understand the making of a settler state and how people who came to be defined as white de-Europeanized themselves and localized themselves through, I suppose, what you can call a discourse of preservation and of care and of belonging to the land through taking the responsibility of caring for nature and natives. And you will see that all of the work that was done in the preservation of the Bushman body happened as part of a concentration on the search for human origins and on paleo-anthropological heritage in South Africa, where some of the crucial figures were Raymond Dart on your right and Philip Tobias on your left. But in this work, my colleague Martin Legassic and I wrote a book that was published 20 years ago now. And our purpose in this book was to explain that the problem in the South African Museum was not so much the body cast. In fact, the debate on body casts served as an alibi for what was indeed a much more nefarious legacy in South African museums. And in this book, we argue that the stolen, disinterred Khoisan body that entered the museum at exactly the same time, at the beginning of the 20th century, lay at the foundation of the modern museum in South Africa. And this happened in the first decade of the 20th century, when South Africa was becoming a nation, in which we experienced the South Africanization of science, in which South Africa lay a prior claim to being able to hold onto Khoisan human remains. And along the way, we uncovered the work that was being done, the expedition and the collecting of a scholar by the name of Rudolf Puch, who in 1907 to 1909 journeyed through South Africa and Namibia and Botswana, and undertook collections that found their way into a spread of institutions in Vienna. And among the human remains that were assembled by Puch and his assistants were the bodies of Klaas and Troy Pienaar, which were taken out of their graves and stuffed into a barrel of salt, placed onto an ox wagon, and eventually transported to Vienna, where, as we described this history to an audience in Vienna of Austrian museum colleagues, suddenly they remembered, we know where these human remains are. By then, they had been macerated and they existed as skeletons in the collection of an anthropologist. And arising out of this, you've got Rudolf Puch, you've got his expedition routes. Arising out of this, there was an immediate offer to return those remains. And after a number of years, the Northern Cape government eventually came to us at the University of the Western Cape, and we engaged in a discussion about what a provincial government can do, what a national government can do, what are the competences involved, and how you are most likely to be able to go about a restitution. We were very fortunate in those days to have the Namibian scholar Memory Biwa, still with us, finishing her PhD, one of the most important studies of how memory of a genocide in southern Namibia at the beginning of the 20th century traveled across borders, how it is remembered in southern Namibia, how differently it is remembered on the other side of the Garib River, and how it is remembered differently by men and women, and how people engage in reenactment in order to remember the events of the genocide. And of course, the people about whose bodies we were talking about were more than likely, or were part of a transfrontier community of people, some of whom had also been put to flight into South Africa at the beginning of the 20th century. Eventually, a human remains repatriation committee was formed, consisting of people in government at different levels, people in museums and scholars, in which we eventually found our way to engage in negotiations in Vienna. And all of you will know where that is taken from. And you will see some of the earliest images from the beginnings of the negotiations, in which you can see the body postures of people taking against each other, because the issues were extremely heated. Those were still, in those days, this was before the retirement of Professor Maria Techler-Nicola. And you see members of government, you see the South African ambassador, you see members of the South African embassy, members of government department. You see right in the center, the member of the Austrian government who completely denied that it was possible to conduct this restitution on the basis of what the South Africans wanted to call a rehumanization. That this has to be a process that takes the dead Khoisan body out of being an object and into being a human being. And it was not just because through the quality of the South African archive we could name people and that you could attach a biography to people. You knew where they died. You knew where they were buried. You knew members of their family. And this is a photograph in the midst of those negotiations. And I only show it because in the midst, as we were engaging in this discussion, Professor Techler announced, unbeknown to the South Africans, that if you look behind you, you will see there are two boxes in which the remains of Klaas and Troy Pienaar are. And she got up and she picked up the pelvis of Troy Pienaar because it had become an object, and held it up and said, you can see she has had children from the marks on her pelvis. And to the horror of the South Africans, it was exactly the issues that were under discussion appeared before their eyes. And the process involved negotiations with local communities, including here the late David Kruiper and Petrus Valboy in the Galagadi region, and extremely heated debates in which it emerged that you might think that the history of collecting that this was involved such a deep colonial history of disruption that it was not possible to construct a biography and a relatedness with living people. But indeed, that was not the case. And it appeared, the stories came to the fore of how the Pienaars were a family who married people by the name of Patmaker. And that you were talking about Troy Pienaar, who came from the Patmaker family. And so it was extremely powerful occasions that took place every day, that then culminated in the ceremonies of restitution, the most powerful of which, in my view, took place inside of the Austrian Academy of Sciences, inside of the Voorkamer, the front hall, in which Petrus Valboy stood before this grand image that stood for the history of science in Austria, and explained to Klaas and Troy Pienaar what was happening and why the group had come to Vienna to fetch them. And of course, what the South Africans did is they worked with an undertaker company who were going to transfer the remains from museum boxes into coffins. So as part, every step and every stage of the rehumanization process, of official ceremonies at the South African embassy, involving the burning of kruiergoed, of Mpepu, and of speeches by politicians, and as Professor Walter Sauer, the former head of the Austrian anti-apartheid movement, and who was central to facilitating, enabling all of these linkages that were at the basis of this restitution, he remembered that that was a day when the Austrian government made a formal apology. And that culminated in the formal reburial of Klaas en Troy Pienaar in a ceremony in 2012 in Kuruman, near Gamopedi, where they came from. The law today says you have to be buried in a municipal cemetery. And so, and of course, as governments do, they do a measure of the incorporation of the dead into the memorial complex. Because one of the ways that new nations make themselves is by reckoning their relationship with particular kinds of deaths. And at the time, we were interested in what are the deaths of the nation. And of course, what has become very clear to us is that the remains of Klaas en Troy Pienaar are part of an incomplete and interrupted process of restitution between Austria and South Africa, in which both governments have lost their memory, in which now, with a change in government and with a changed ethos in the museum field, much more amenable to questions of restitution, when in 4 or 5 years in Germany, the debate went from having a balanced approach to one that is entirely in favor of restitution, that the conditions have not been more amenable. Perhaps not as well as funded as in Germany. Austria has also created a desk of colonial collections inside of a department of Holocaust-related lost art. And so there is a lot of work to do. We are dealing with an unfinished history. But as we go through that process, there are the skeletons in the cupboard, of course, also had an impact in South Africa, in which the main National Museum, Iziko Museums of South Africa, have gone through a process of de-accessioning unethically collected human remains, in which it was decided that human remains are deemed to be unethically present in the collection if they were collected for the purposes of racial research and if they were stolen from their graves and purchased from grave robbers, as is more the case than we think. And so what Iziko has done is it has created this no-access zone while human remains have been de-accessioned and placed in this no-access space until such time as restitution occurs. Because the question arises, how do you do a restitution? How do you go about doing, and is a restitution a repatriation? And what does it mean for the museum? What does it mean for living people who have a relationship with the dead? And it's becoming increasingly clear to us that restitution cannot be understood through the paradigm of events management. These are not just events to be determined by what kind of aeroplane, what kind of box, what kind of ceremony. What we are talking about are the very elements in the Savoir-Faire report that talks about the possibilities of a new ethical relationship. So when we do restitution, we need to talk about what kind of epistemic work needs to happen alongside this. And in Austria, in Germany, in the German-speaking world, in other parts of Europe, we're interested in the history of disciplines and how they were configured and how anthropology was separated from ethnology and what that has meant for collections. Because in the restitution work that we are busy with in Germany at the moment, as part of the Lushan collection in the Museum of Prehistory and Early History, busy in the middle of a return of 1,200 remains to Rwanda, where the human remains of colonial racism are going to meet the human remains of the genocide. And as we have heard in the previous panel, in a totally connected history of the formation of ideas of race. How do you go about that? And what has emerged is that Tchaikovsky, the expedition leader in this case, did not only collect human remains, at the same time, he made field sound recordings. And so how do you connect human remains to other collections? And as we know, that in the case of the Pinars, we can reconstruct the ox wagon on which their bodies and those of Kou, Kruisband and Masebi and others who we can name were transported to the ship and brought to eventually to Vienna. And so what's emerging from the cooperative work that Berlin is doing with the Museums Association of Namibia are just the extent to which we need to have an ancestral understanding, not just of the remains of people, but also of the artifacts that accompanied them, artifacts that have a soul. And so it's been very interesting for us also to know, as South Africa has struggled with this question of the dead and created an institution called Freedom Park on Salvo Kop in Pretoria as the main memorial site that has been created by the state in the wake of the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And as we look at the scene, at what is called Isivivane, this garden of remembrance, where a position was taken not to return the human remains of former fighters who fell in other parts of Africa and in other parts of the world, but to return soil, rocks into a memorial system. The question arises for us, what are the connections between the colonial dead and the dead of apartheid? The research that has happened on those who were executed by the apartheid state, those who died in prison, who were former guerrillas and who were buried as paupers, but are being identified and are being returned to families by the Missing Persons Task Team, that indeed we need to think about this concept of missingness, and that indeed the colonial dead also represent a category of missingness. I want to end by talking about one final matter. That is a matter of extreme irony as we go about these debates and as we go about these negotiations. And there are many conferences, many meetings, and each one achieves something new. Each moment is a moment in development. The Cologne conference last year was an electrifying moment of an interrogation of the neo-colonial politics of entanglement, and what that means. Namely, that we are talking about the movement of people across histories, across borders, and through the histories that join societies together. It is extremely ironic that those of us who need access to this information do not have access to Fortress Europe. That in fact you have an existence of a global apartheid of those who are free to move and those who do not move. Those of you who watch Southern Africa will know that South African Airways is in difficulty right now. Of course, we've had extreme corruption and state capture in South Africa. But the main problem of South African Airways is that its client base are people who do not have the freedom to develop the desire to travel because they need visas And it is almost impossible to get visas. In fact, one of the important things for you to know is that South African whites are, I think, the only whites in the world who are not allowed to travel. They need visas like other Africans do. So it's what we have here is that if we are going to go through this period of enhancing the discussions over these shared histories, those are the very questions that have to be tackled so that we have a level playing field. So I think I will leave it there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ciraj. Now, I'd like to introduce my other co-panelist, Marina Gržinić, has been a professor at the Academy of Fine Arts, Vienna. I'm sure here everyone knows you, but there are also other people coming from outside. In Vienna since 2003. She is a philosopher, theoretician, and artist from Ljubljana, Slovenia, where she is professionally affiliated with the ZRC Sazu Institute of Philosophy. She publishes extensively lectures worldwide and has been involved in video film production with Aina Smith since 1982, selections of books, New Feminism, World of Feminism, Queer and Networking Conditions, co-edited with Rosa Reitzhammer, 2008, Necropolitics, Racialization and Global Capitalism, Historicization of Biopolitics and Forensic of Politics, Art and Life with Sefik Tatlik, 2014, and Border Thinking, Disassembling Histories of Racialized Violence, editor, 2018. Marina, it's yours.
Good. Thank you very much to Anna and you for the invitation, also to VHB, making this larger format, and also to all the speakers. Thank you, Ciraj. This was very on the point. So I will actually go on to these elements of possibility of mobility or not questions, as in my title is saying, how to blow the world of racial global necrocapitalism and provoke rebellion power thoughts. And I will focus actually on Europe and Austria, of course, and this will be one of the central points, and also today, what's going on, but how to go to this point from the past. So I am departing, actually, as was stated in my summary, from 2 points. One is the book that just came out with the title Opposing Colonialism, Anti-Semitism and Turbo-Nationalism, and was published this year. Anti-Semitism relates to Austria, colonialism to Belgium, and turbo-nationalism to ex-Yugoslavia. So these three lines of genocidal politics are central to part of this discussion, what I want to say, and also this book is coming out from another process of research that is going on in the last few years. It will stop this year and has the title Genealogy of Amnesia, Rethinking the Past for a New Future of Conviviality. The second point is is actually the question of structural racisms and racializing formats. And practically what we could see today is that they are working hand in hand, but not only in the EU, but specifically in Austria with police administrative systems. And how we see this contemporaneity, it's going back to what was said. Actually, you have a whole structure in the back that reject visas, even to regular students, and especially when they are coming from so-called third world countries. And also we see in the whole space of Europe and Austria regimes of what I call phobic anti-refugee politics. So this is a kind of fundament of what I want to say. In short, I will discuss actually global neoliberal necrozones, where misery, exclusion, and death are manufactured, administered, normalized, and also aestheticized. So this aesthetical element is quite present in all this discussion. Simply to put, what these necrozones, this necropolitics means, it's this logic of these necrozones, of this administration, of this bureaucratic intervention is political, because it refers to management and administration of structural racism. So structural racism is really transcending this psychology. It's psychological, of course, because actually attack directly people, make them vulnerable, afraid, and so on, but it's actually a management and administration. In Austria, it's really palpable. It is necro. Why? Because the object of management of this politics, and necro means death, is death zones and events carried out by sovereign, like they call themselves, sovereign entities, entities that are actually became sovereign after 2001. And we actually have today what we can see really, I say again in Austria, what I can learn from 2003, that I'm here, and Austria is part of the EU, so that means it's really palpable to talk about the European Union. We have the sovereign war state, we have the sovereign bank, the sovereign debt, the sovereign police, the sovereign bureaucrat that decides of the visa, the sovereign shit of us whites. This is very clear, and the omnipresent sovereign multinational corporation. Today, it is these sovereign entities that decides to one thing, and they actually decide through all these systems not just about pushing somebody out of the state, but really on who may live and who must die. So attached directly to the question of who lives and who dies or just disappeared. And this is actually, this who may live and who must die is this elementary definition, a definition for a children's book almost, of what means necropolitics. It's very simple. This is what is necropolitics in the words of Achille Mbembe. As Ebony Rose suggests, to this necropolitics, and even before to the biopolitics, race and racism are central. They are at the center of this, what is possible to be called bio-necropolitical project. Regarding these visas and all what's going on, a student in the Academy of Fine Arts, her name is Iklim Dogan, she speaks of visa rejection papers that are going massively, but absolutely unknown, so to say, or are produced in an intensity of waiting to students from third countries, and they study regularly in Austria, and she calls this an archive of pain, because thousands of pages are actually issued yearly. We don't have an idea about the amount of this, and practically what is possible to learn is that the autonomy of, that it's actually the autonomy of the universities is not anymore the one who decides, but instead of the autonomy of the university decides actually, and the autonomy of the university was a bastion of Occident freedom. This is what all it's about from the fall, from the Second World War, but today actually the police and its mechanisms with the bureaucrats and different administration bodies, they decide actually of such banal things if the students have enough points to stay or not in the European Union. this is quite a serious element of these processes of racialization. And this is actually a basis of what I could also fear when it was the question posed. Actually, I learned that the question was not posed about language in the previous panel by somebody from the public, but it was really about these elements of structural inequality and structural racism that permits the whole space. In order to present just very, very schematically this entanglement, to just pull some things out, I have to speak because the title is Necropolitics, so I will talk about biopolitics, racialization, necropolitics, and in the end of these possibilities of resistance. I would like to actually put very initially also which are the sources of my thinking, how actually these links between biopolitics and necropolitics that Ebony Rose connects directly to race and racism, and I even connect to the whole processes of racialization stands. The works that I want to just go through is Hortense Spiller's Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American Grammar, from a book from 1987. Then Etienne Balibar, that is a text on race and culture from 2011. Then Joshua Dunn, 2017, Crossroads of the Living and the Dead, Necropolitics and Market Logic in Chris Ebony's Graceland, and also Ebony Rose, that is the book, a text from 2016, Afrostasis, Understanding the Necro-Biopolitical Collaboration in the Creation of the Carcelarization of Black Life Death. Also, one of the elements of these processes, for me, it's important to show this genealogy. We are not just brought from somewhere and put here and then we declamate our text, but we are actually formed. It's a process of formations behind, and these texts are important because people made research, and we actually also make this lineage to this research, and we reflect on them. So it's also the aesthetics of necropolitics, a volume by Natasha Lušetić that was published in 2018. I was writing for this. And finally, what could be maybe a possibility to say something about this resistance is Catherine McKittrick, 2014 book on Sylvia Winter on being human as praxis, that maybe it will be some of this answer to what kind of thoughts of or possibility of resistance is possible to be done. In short, what is my task? First, think race and racialization in relations to such categories, national citizens, second and third class citizens, and of course, non-citizens. Second, it's also connected with a certain idea, and actually it's actually a certain myth, that from 2000, especially in the German countries, or in the Occident or in the West, was pull out, and this was this idea of the empty center of Western biopower. So that exists an empty center that is exempted from the processes of racialization. So some space in which you have this possibility, and this element was actually very crucial to citizens' rights to a green and what they call harmonious cities. But what we see actually is that these empty centers more and more proved that this actually is a stumbling block that prevents us from seeing that racialization is fundamental to all processes of differentiation, exclusion and ghettoization. And also that this supposedly empty public space, this empty center of Western biopower, is due to processes of intensified cleansing and control, what? An erased cleansed and violently dispossessed center. And also this is why we actually see that this public space in the West, in the Occident, showed a change from a public space, this myth of the 70s, to a deathscape through processes of racialization. I go with biopolitics. So, very shortly, it's this term in the book, Society Must Be Defended, Lectures at the College of France, 75-76, by Michel Foucault. Practically, what it's one of the elements, only one of this huge elaboration and staying on biopolitics is that Foucault make one important shift, and this is a historical shift in focus from man as body to man as species. And this is also one of the biopolitics that was clear in the 70s. But with this passage, Foucault biopolitics asserts itself also through man as body to man as species, through calculation and management. And this is this big idea of the welfare states, management and calculation, birth and death rates, and so on. And also the modification of many other things like epidemic disease, endemic illness, and so on. So what is coming out from this process of biopolitics, we see still Europe is residing in this biopolitics. And we see now when we think of what's going on with the relation to coronavirus, this prevention, this foreclosure. And my thesis is that to every aspect of biopolitics today in neoliberal global capitalism, we actually have an answer. The EU has an answer, and this is necropolitical foreclosure. So you close yourself, you ghettoize, you actually export, you deport it, and so on. So what we learn is that to every positivist biopolitical paranoia follows measures that as answers, and they are all necropolitical. Also, one element that I want to pick regarding this biopolitics is that at that point in the 70s, Foucault pushed something that was important, especially now, and this is the definition of state racism. And he said that state racism will exceed actually racism. And also he brings something that it's a measure of differentiation. He said exist subgroups and exist the normal population. And in this way, he conceives of two elements or two functions of racism. One is that actually the first purpose of racism is to make a break. It's not just to function psychologically, but to make a break within the biological continuum of what is the nation state. So the subgroups are put out. And we see again this so vividly, clearly, in all these rhetorics. Subgroups are out, the nation body, the majoritarian nation body has to be preserved, and this is also what Foucault called biopower. But the second element of structural racism is what he says, it's ultimatum. And this is, if you want to live, you must be able to kill. This was produced in the 70s. So in a certain way, also this state racism in Foucault way that we see palpably in these decades, in these years, and so on, is that the right to kill for the welfare states, for the first world, for Europe, is not a deviation from the biopolitical. It's actually a norm. The norm how the community, the society, the states, the racist state, I will say, is functioning. This bind in which the death of one human being is directly related to the life of another is what Foucault say the definition of state racism. And also, this state racism survived, and it's reappearing, but differently in Membe. This is why I pulled this out in this necropolitical view that Achille Membe produced in 2000, because the idea is that this state racism is today seen like as a measure of security, but is actually a very perfect poisoning element of discrimination. Is something that is really deadly. If you want to live, you must be able to kill. And even more, when he's talking about this in the 70s, it's no connection to the post-World War influx of migrants, post-colonial subjects, and so on. So if we go to racialization, it's this complex regime of hyper-violent discrimination, dispossession, exploitation, and dehumanization. I made here, for this part, reference to the text of Hortense Spillers from 1978, that was also mentioned before, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American grammar book, and practically Spillers entwines histories of enslavement with family structure in order to expose the formation of gender and race in the US. In doing so, she clarifies the implications of vocabularies, naming, and also terminology. For Spillers, names used to describe black women are actually nominative properties, entwined with ethics, aesthetics, and with religious values. Spiller suggests, in order to think outside the dominant American grammar, that we will say outside of this grammar of the global world that is under the hand of actually power, capital, and so on, we have to search in other vocabularies and grammars for countering the normalized ruptures within the so-called legitimacy of white normative gender race class construction. Spillers also talk about the Middle Passage related to the special status of the slave flesh, arguing that millions of blacks that were kidnapped, sold, and enslaved represents a 0 degree of social conceptualization. To this point, that is important in that time of the 1978 that was put apart, but actually was very eloquently said and stated what's going on in the American society. Another theoretician is coming back, and this is Alexander Vehilier, because he is saying in his book from 2014, Habeas Viscus, Racializing Assemblages, Biopolitics, and Black Feminist Theories of the Human, that practically it's these necro and bio differences, it's also something relating to the body. He says that practically to think humanity means to think it as habeas viscus. So he go back to the question of the human. And habeas viscus is actually having a flesh, intestines, while she has not habeas corpus, because habeas corpus is a category of biopolitics. It's used and reserved for the nation states' biopolitical exercise of hegemonic power and its brutal differentiation between majoritarian national body and all other generations of ethnicities. And this is precisely what is going on in Austria and in the European Union in the present moment. Again, we see this constant differentiation between biopolitics and necropolitics. But between Spillers and Vehilier, it's actually this important analysis by Attia and Balibar. He suggests in 2011 that the condition of transfer from generations to generations that adapts and naturalizes processes of racialization and of brutal dehumanization is, in the present day EU, executed precisely along the lines of skin of color. And I think this is, again, this element of structural racism that persists, and it's individuated in 2011 very precisely by Etienne Balibar. In the genealogical scheme, race or culture, he is actually making many reasons why is from 2011 this big resurgence of nationalism and racism. And maybe it's not him or it's my reading, but I see three elements that help us to understand what is actually that we see, for example, with all these rejections of visa, with all these always again repeating phrases, go back from where you are, all these things that are connected with the past colonialism, but actually are not made explicit and get another form. The first is that when the nation form becomes challenged and undergoes a crisis, which happens all the time, the development of racist ideologies and practices appear as a natural solution. So we have then the processes of racialized refugees, marginalized migrants, fragmented and destroyed communities, and all of them marked by the skin color line. The second point is that he envisioned this very clearly in the French Banlieues, that exists actually a kind of a myth of a natural community, a pure myth, a fiction, but is constructed on a double rejection, and is constructed on a double rejection of prohibition and stigmatization. Second, third generation of those who came after the colonial adventures of France after the Second World War are actually prohibited to have a genealogy, and all the time they have the stigma of origin. And this is the second factor that brings this racism strongly at the focus, and it's not only in France. In Austria is working 100%, and in the whole EU. And then thirdly, what it's one important thing. This is the thing that practically what terrifies the regime of whiteness is not anymore the ancestors, but the children. Why? Because exists and is becoming very palpable that the white bourgeois nation state, that more of them are functioning on the level of EU, it's actually very much afraid of what could be a name cross-reproduction or miscegenation. So this is something that organize this space, and we see very well that through anti-Muslim racism that is coming and imbricated in this Occidental colonialism, and in Austria, practically this anti-Muslim racism works with the new rise of an overt anti-Turkish racism. So things that were before seemed in the past, they are coming back, and analysts like Luca Seger, Asimina Guma state that Austria ultra-right-wing nationalists expose anti-Muslim racism so heavily as this allowed them, as in a bad theater play where we are, first to have a scapegoat for the misery of capitalism, because to actually, in a certain way, cover another myth, and this was the myth of welfare state, and secondly, to distance themselves from anti-Semitism. This is really a bad joke. Because, why? We know that at the heart of this country is actually a poisoning anti-Semitism at the center of Austria. We know from the research, and then I will finish, because of because we know that exist from our research that we did, books and interviews in which it's clear that the Austrian Freedom Party, an ultra-right-wing party, is formed by members that grown out from the former Austrian members of the Nazis in the Second World War. So they were then, in the 50s, very easily integrated in the Austrian society, and what another theoretician, Oliver Radkolb, called a shameful integration in the 50s. So, to come to 2 points for the end, the first one is we don't have today the situation of liminality. That means something in between. It's very famous, in between. No, we have the situation of immobility and not liminality, not in a between, not neither nor, not quite or not yet, but we have really this foreclosure, this complete immobilization, a hyper-violence, and all this in between are actually the characteristic of modernity. So practically the dimension of necropolitics resides precisely in seizure, captivity, and immobilization. And these are the main elements of the necropolitical that was envisioned by Member. And to finish, and to still give maybe 2 final sentences to the last part, that means this resistance of the necropolitical, I finish in such a way that I actually expose what I said as my source. Catherine McKittrick, Sylvia Wynter, she made a book on being human ex praxis. So what could be a solution? In this book, Wynter suggests that we should actually go back to making a reference to Aimé Césaire. She is saying, first we have to rewrite our present in another order of knowledge. This is one of the way that Sylvia Wynter is rethinking on this proposition, how to resist. And secondly, making a reference to Frantz Fanon, she states, we have to initiate the exploration of a new reconceptualized form of knowledge that would be called for by Fanon redefinition of being human as that of skin and masks. So she said we have to look through elements. One is the skin, the phylogeny, and the mask is the sociogeny. It's between this kind of differentiation biology and culture. And notice, Wynter exclaims, one major implication here is coming from this. And this implication is humanness is no longer a noun. Being human is a praxis. I will say a political praxis, a practice of resistance. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina. I actually hate, that to stop people talking. And if I would be you, I would do the same. So to continue with the reference that you did at the end on Aimé Césaire, and with what Ciraj has started to talk about, restitution, I'd like to start with a lecture that will revisit the question of restitution and also elaborate it a little bit, because since the French speech of Macron in Ouagadougou 2 years ago, we've been talking a lot on restitution without really knowing what does it mean. Like Aimé Césaire explained in his discourse against colonialism, fascism is colonialism domestic version, colonialism back home. It is therefore important to keep in mind how the Nazi regime got inspired by the processes of control over colonized people. For instance, the Algerian general government was an example for the Polish general government under the Nazi occupation. French colonization in Algeria, which was settler colonization, has been an inspiration for colonial projects by the German fascist regime. Indeed, while exterminating Jewish populations, they also aimed at replacing them by German ones. while at the same time Germanizing the rest of the local Christian people, like in Poland, for instance. What Aimé Césaire is calling out in his famous discourse, and which is until now barely admitted by the Western governments that want to escape their responsibilities, is the biased vision of the fascist aspect of former colonial empires. In her book, The Colonial Trauma, the Algerian psychoanalyst Karima Lazali names this le non-lieu, a legal term that would be translated by cased dismissed. But in French, it can also literally mean that hasn't happened, non-lieu, ça n'a pas eu lieu, it didn't happen. Ça n'a pas eu lieu, in order to emphasize the attempt to erase the crime by denying its existence. Can we have the slide 1 and 2, please? Beyond the name of General Government of Algeria, the project of the Polish General Government took inspiration from the colonial infrastructure implemented by the French colonizers in Algeria. But this goes even further. In France, the narrative about the victory over the Nazi regime has built a whole rhetoric in the face of the horror of Nazi crimes, but at the same time separating them from any possible connection to be shared colonial history of France and its allies. France is my main focus because it is part of my personal history. Until now, it continues through its ways of dealing with the Nazi genocide to rewrite history. The main problem with this revised history is that it takes away the responsibility toward the normalized fascism we are witnessing today. By turning Hitler and his fascist followers into demons, monsters, they have made them irrational, as well as the crimes they have committed. A crime so monstrous that it cannot be explained. In France, you have all this popular rhetoric that says, plus jamais ça, it was impossible, how this could happen. While saying never again, France erases the rational dimension of Holocaust and all its ramifications, the phantom limbs that echoes its responsibility and that of the German regime. Indeed, the main political stake is the control of memory by the winner. History in general, and particularly the one of the colonizer, is written by the winners. It indeed seems that at the end of a conflict, it always serves the best interest of a political project, national reconstruction. That's why May 18, 1945 commemorations of the victory over the Nazis, celebrated worldwide, totally conceal the biggest anti-colonial uprising ever in the French Empire that took place in Sétif, the city of my ancestor, also on May 18, 1945. Then more than 20,000 Algerians were massacred. Their only demand was to gain their freedom as it had been promised to them after fighting alongside the French army against the Nazis. The reappropriation of symbols such as historical dates and iconic political images is crucial to rewrite the collective narrative that has been completely destroyed by an alien power. The independence war in Algeria started in 1954. In Algeria, for 7 years, during the War of Independence against France, my paternal grandmother collected all the old jewels given to her by women from farms in our mountainous region in order to support the resistance. One gave earrings, the other a bracelet, the other a necklace, and all these objects were accumulated and then melted into silver bullion in order to be sold to buy weapons for the resistance. That's how I first became interested in Berber jewelry from Algeria. Then, from the ethic of this story, I carefully observed the aesthetic aspect of this precious object. And to my great surprise, I discovered that they were all made with some of, or even several coins representing either the leaders of the empires that colonized them or their political motto, like the French liberty, equality, fraternity. Can we go to slide 4 to 17? Thank you. Repair is an oxymoron because injury is its raison d'être. One cannot think about repairing something that hasn't been injured. The state of the injured things, the failure, and the state of the repaired things, the repair, are forever bound in a causal layout that runs in the ethical and aesthetic loop of a repair. This is true for whole metaphor of repair, natural, cultural, political, immaterial, and so on. For instance, repair is not necessarily closing up a crack in one single object. It can also embody the merger of two objects from two different cultures, as we could see with objects from ancient societies that have incorporated symbols of occupying forces. It is the case of Algerian Berber jewel incorporating coins representing the ruler of colonial occupants, like portraits of Napoleon and King Leopold. Ancient societies have emancipated themselves from the social, aesthetic, and ethical order in which the modern Western occupying forces, feeling nostalgic of the antiquity they like to identify them with, have maintained them. By doing so, they have started to escape the position of victim of the humiliation led by the hegemony of technological superiority. That's why the reappropriation of the perspective from which these invaded populations have been subtracted is a repair, because bringing together two orders of production, one manual and the other standardized, one unique and the other mass-produced, has never suffered from the limit imposed by mimetic mimesis. So it shall not be limited to a mimetic symptoms, but seen as an act of resistance. And until today, this unpredictable rebellion is relevant. Because this incarnation of a resistance, cannibalizing a modern symbol of the occupant, like in the Algerian jewel's case, for instance, weakens the logic of restitution as repair, the famous debate in which we are now everywhere in the ethnographic field. On the contrary, it is leading the possible fragmentation of the final objects in two sides. The non-westernized crafted ones would go to their original place, and the French Western standardized coins at the Museum of the Coins in Paris or wherever. The metaphors of which repair is the name are plenty and complex, but they all have a common denominator as soon as the difference between the modernity and pre-modernity of repair is revealed. Modernity obsessed with erasing the injury has promoted repair as an ideal return to the original state of the injured things. The word repair, réparer, or reparaturen auf Deutsch, finds its origin in the Latin word reparare, to refit, to restore, to rebuild, to put back in order. Clear signifier of this obsession to erase the injury erected by reason as the dogma of superiority on time, history, belief, object being. So we can think about the cosmetic industry today, etc. But what interests me is this notion of return to the origin in terms of mirroring it with fascism. Nowadays, we have pushed this obsession for control even further, to the point that we do not repair an object to bring it back to its original form anymore. Repair is not necessary anymore. We just have to replace it by a new one. This particularly contemporary and capitalistic issue of replacement is also at stake in the restitution of despoiled goods. How? And above all, why could millions of ancient objects from non-Western cultures stored in Western ethnographic museums be replaced by copies in resin or plastic, looking perfectly identical, as this is often claimed by Western pro-restitution voices as a type of way to repair the void this return will leave? To understand why the issue of a pure and simple replacement is problematic, even in our contemporary capitalistic and consumerist world, it is necessary to draw a genealogy of these questions relating to objects and referring to human activities from enslaved and colonized ancient cultures to Western modern museums. First of all, this issue has to be humanized, because the objects are not objects, but they are subjects. The objects have existed in a bodily reality that used to rule them through a correlation in which the individual body and the social body of the society they belonged to were interdependent of this object. Any object, would it be sacred or secular, has been created and sculpted by an individual. When a sacred object, it has been charged with the beliefs of the social group it belonged to. ritualized in a common and daily functionality for everyday life objects, or an exceptional one for sacred objects. They were in any case also interdependent subjects of the social order they helped to maintain. As soon as they have been taken from their community, either by fanatic missionaries or selfish intellectuals, like it is described in Phantom Africa by Michel Léris, or forever destroyed in auto da fe, like the Capuchin missionaries did in Congo, they have left a void like a phantom limb, which will, they have left a void that, like a phantom limb, will endlessly demand a return to their original community. Can we see the slide 19, please? And 20. The huge quantity of expropriated objects that is still present in Western ethnographic museums and which have been brought there directly from villages is a mirror effect of the phantom limb left in situ and which demands the return to the native land, the part torn away, amputated of these collective and individual bodies, deported to another space and time, the one of a contemporary relic. That is very important to understand. Why a relic? During the Middle Ages, the Western world used to be obsessed with relics of saint martyrs, bones, hair, for instance. As early as 1164, the bones of the three kings have been transferred to the Cathedral of Cologne in Germany by Frederick I and have remained there until now. Like any African mask or fetish, relics in the Middle Age would bring spiritual strength and would keep societies tight against inside and outside enemies. Some relics would attract huge crowds. They were coveted and wars would be declared to get them. It is at that point crucial to remember the most macabre dispossession in colonial history, the deportation of human remains, bones, and skulls taken from resistance fighters against colonialism everywhere within the colonial empires, from Amérindian lands, from Algeria, from New Caledonia, Senegal, and South Africa, as Ciraj mentioned before, and are still stored in many Western museums, like in Musée de l'Homme in Paris, but of course in Dahlem in Berlin as well, and I'm sure at the Volkerkunde here you can find human remains. Even if Président Macron said in December 17, « Je souhaite que la restitution des crânes soit décidée, je la défierai, je suis prêt. I wish that the restitution of skulls be decided, I will make it happen, I'm ready. Nothing has happened since then. On April 18, 2018, Algerian historian Ali Farid Belkadi counts 536 Algerian skulls in the Parisian museum storages, lost among the collection of 18,000 skulls of Musée de l'Homme. The decapitated heads of Algerian resistance fighters have long been forgotten. His work revealed hundreds of skulls in this storage which has belonged to resistance fighters against French colonization in the 19th century. Among these skulls, anonymous people lay next to war chiefs like Sheriff Bourabla, initiator of a local revolt in 1851, or Sheikh Bouziane, who held the siege of Sahacha during 4 months in 1849. The cult of relics is the appropriation of power by proxy of storing the other's bodies. That's why human remains stored in French museums were resistance fighters against colonial hegemony, war chiefs like these Algerian, or also the Caledonian chief Attia and the Maori warrior skulls. Just to a parenthesis, the Algerian skulls until now, the moment we are talking, are still there at the museum, Musée de l'Homme in Paris. Even if relics were made of human remains, hair, teeth, bones, etc., they were above all metaphorical prostheses. In pre-modern time, during centuries, we know a big part of the population was amputated of a finger, a leg, an arm. Prostheses were a second nature of the body. Can we go to slide 29 to 51, please? Thank you. A society in which amputation was common was a society in which the culture of prosthesis was normal. Crutches, wooden leg, fake wooden hand, etc. Over centuries, prostheses have imprinted the Western collective unconscious through modernity and until now. What does the huge quantity of objects brought what does the huge quantity of objects brought directly from the non-Western world, dominated by the Western world and kept in its museum storage, show, if not the continuity of a belief in the prosthesis repairing an absence, a deficiency inherited from the Middle Ages, and that gave birth to the cabinet of curiosity. The Western obsession for accumulating elements of social cohesion, like artworks or cult objects from other cultures, can be linked to the power of some artifact, like the justice mask from the Gere people in Ivory Coast, that would be brought out to solve the community's disputes. Ancient artworks kept in Western museums have been uprooted, creating phantom limbs that endlessly call for their return from Occident. They have therefore become prostheses of an intellectual and artistic scene that, facing the opacity of the modernity of a world submitted to technological progress, had kept them away from the immaterial field of creation. The unknown forces of which these objects were the guardians and their unpredictable aesthetic have been uphooted for prostheses for the modern Western intellectuals. Intellectuals, artists, have indeed felt amputated from the invisible and unknown world through the age of reason, and would be connected to the unpredictable via these objects and the beliefs of which they are the legacy. The prostheses embodied by these objects have allowed a kind of augmented reality. What seems to be different between yesterday and today is that when Picasso was watching an African mask or sculptures and elaborated the revolution of representation in the Western art he belonged to, he had no electronic device between his eye and the object, but only his predator genius agency. The extra reality this art was carrying helped him and still helps us to see differently and then strengthens our ways of thinking together the otherness, without justifying who we are and who are the other, what Edouard Glissant called a right for opacity. We don't have to justify. A right for opacity, because the essence of what has been taken will never be returned. What the political discourse about restitution is denying. If you do an analogy between the transatlantic bodies and the object, of course, when President Macron is like offering the restitution of the iconic representation of God in Benin, even the throne of the former King Gezo, is claiming reparation, is pretending that he's repairing something. The crimes of colonialism, or the crimes of slavery, I would say the slavery and then the colonialism, will never be repaired. But even worse, we should wonder whether this agenda of restitution is not playing another ideology of the origin towards the country, which, as Dorsey said before, quoting a friend on Sunday, Wilfried Sunday, traditions dictate us laws that belong to the dead people. The question of restitution can be also the pretension that by returning the object, nothing did happen, and even transmitting within this agenda the ideology of the purity of the origin, which is highly critical. What I would suggest to answer this very complex question that is the restitution is that if you consider that the restitution involves fields such as law, economy, psychoanalysis, history, cultures, politics, we need to reinvent probably a place within, or let's say, another epistemology in which restitution will become a field of studies. I don't think that we can, I'm not, I would say, even for or against restitution. Restitution question is a tunnel from which, if we try to live at the same time by the two axes, it doesn't make sense. It's impossible. It's a trick that we really have to, I think, in the coming decades, work and elaborate to understand how the object can be part of a human movement in a speed where everyone has access, of course, Ivory Coast, Algeria, etc., but without creating another phantom limb. I would end also by Professor Hadak from Ivory Coast, who said to me in an interview that after a century, those objects that are now in the West became white also. It's good that we know where they are. We need to map this. We need to map where are all the objects. But as an anthropologist teaching at the University of Abidjan, the last 25 years, I can tell you that most of the time, the average of number of students who are doing a PhD on African artifact, Ivory Coast is extremely rich, is about the number of 5 students. So that's why I wanted to hand into this sort of complexity that without depicting a sort of dead hand, there is a way to leave the tunnel by reinventing an epistemology for the question of restitution. It doesn't make sense today that in any academia in the West, there's no field, there's no department about restitution. Thank you very much. After I remove my hat and I take I remove and I take the mask. So I have the honor to moderate this panel with Marina and Ciraj. Please do not ask me question first. Ask to my panelists because I just spoke. I would invite you to ask question to the co-panelists and open the Q&A.
Can I say something?
Of course, yeah.
No, I just wanted to just connect what I was listening, and I think that one thing it's going also on your line, but on a different point of view. For us here, it's also interesting to understand because the question of restitution is connecting with really making another treatment to the object, but on the same time today. You actually have, and this is a fact, thousands of people that are actually transformed in objects. They are immobilized from Europe. They cannot move. They will be deported. So in a certain way, it's a kind of very troubling relation between the questions that you said about restitution and actually on the other side, the whole subgroups, ethnicities that are put on the same status actually of absolute objectiveness. So I think also in this way it's very important to think what is the past and this idea, okay, we will give you back, and on the other part what in the same time is done in the European Union, because I can speak from here because I'm living here and I see these processes of immobilization, hyper-violences, bodies as corpse. This is the reality of these kind of communities that are actually very much divided into sub-communities. So,
of course, I mean, it's, thank you, Marina, for pointing the correlation between object and bodies is even today still relevant, because it's incredible to see how hypocrite is the political French discourse about restitution. And last time I was in Dakar, there was the restitution of a sword of a warrior from Senegal, Attia, Chertal. And at the same time, France is probably the most strict country regarding refugees. I mean, we all know that for those people who have been able to go to Paris, that arriving in Paris, at the limit of Paris, you have all these slums and shantytown where refugees live. I mean, it's very important to mention that we can mirror the question of the refugees and that are completely refused by the French, totally, and this sort of narrative of repair that is behind the speech of Macron has, again, I started my lecture talking about the way that you have two speeches regarding May 1945 in France. I think this idea of rationalizing some issues and irrationalizing some other makes that indeed what means, I mean, the way that the so-called winners are rewriting the history is something that hijacked our way of thinking and our way of being critical regarding some issues. So the question of the refugees is true. Ciraj, you want to say something?
I mean, I obviously understand these complexities, and one is never talking about a single model. At the same time, one has to look at the relationship between all of these different projects of reconstituting society, these different projects of repair, including reparations, because and reparations is a whole difficult field, but now because of archives that are being opened up, particularly in Britain, and because of research that has been happening, you are able to make financial calculations of the forms of wealth that were created by compensation payouts to former slave owners, and how that wealth passed down in families, and how they then were transferred into settler colonies like Australia. The origins of the South African banking and insurance system coincides with the compensation payout. So apart from that, I mean, restitution is not just a physical transfer, holus bolus of everything from one place to another. It is one strategy that has to be accompanied by other strategies. For me, the most important work that has to take place is on the intellectual worlds of objects, and how those can be reconstituted. You are not the whole idea of societies having had a kind of a stability of being an originary source community is naive. So you are already talking about returns to societies that have fundamentally transformed. And so all of this work that we need to do is, as you say, it's new work. It is an entirely new field. In my view, what we are talking about is, with restitution being the basis of an entirely new concept of museum. In fact, in which museum is not the collection itself, but the museum is the new forms of relationship that you constitute. And it's about the transactions, about the exchanges. And I mean, that is work that we have to do, and it has to be founded on research. We are scratching at the surface. We know a little bit. We have a little bit of a debate that has emerged now with savoir-faire, which mainly pertains to former Francophone colonies, and particularly to West Africa. From my point of view, this is an opportunity to strengthen African institutions. This is an opportunity to ask about what the capacities are in African societies to make claims, and how one can build those capacities. Because this has got to be far more than just an assuaging of some kind of European guilt and some kind of new form of giving on the part of Europeans. So this is a big field, and we are only scratching at the surface here.
You're right, and as you illustrate in your lecture, Restitution tells more about a national narrative than... Okay, yeah. Okay, we can take the question from the audience. Thank you, Anna.
Kader, I wanted to ask you a question, and I'm very jet lagged, so I apologize if I am saying something you already said or mishearing you. I just want to make a comment that's about a worry. So I think about the extraction out of life worlds, out of cosmological systems, out of ontology, as a kind of prosthesis for Europe and of whiteness, that the extraction and acquisition actually becomes part of the ontology of Europe and of the European self, is to collect these things. But I also worry that, so there's that prosthetic function for Europe. I also worry that, going to this point about liberal guilt, the returning them would also be a kind of prosthesis for whiteness and reinforce certain notions of European and white civility. And so I worry about that in terms of this question of like what is broken cannot be repaired. And so it seems like there is a move to return when it then becomes possible to appropriate return in a way that reinforces an emergent definition of whiteness and of Europe and of civility. At that moment, then return can happen, right? Or it has happened historically. And so I wonder what might be possible in the way of actually a dissolution of the being of Europe, of whiteness, that can happen, because the taking and the giving back can actually reinforce the kind of ontological hierarchies between Europe and Africa. And so I'm just thinking about that. In what ways does the giving back actually become the dissimulation of further taking?
It's a good point, but I think you have to understand what I said before, and I'm sure you do, that the winner, especially in terms of colonialism, write the history. I grew up in a world where my father, an Algerian communist, always told me that, remember that the history, our history have been written by others. Because I was reading a lot, he was always telling me. He never told me you should burn the colonial library, ever. He said, yeah, they are interesting things. But you have to understand that you've been hijacked from this sort of narrative that you can call whiteness. Houria Boutelja, in her book, Les Juifs, les Blancs et nous, call this la blanchité, the whiteness. And my father told me, in French and Algerian, la blanchité a un prix. The whiteness has a price. It's not for free. I'm also talking to all artists also who are now playing also this sort of black or Arab whiteness. It has a price. What is this price? The price is that you actually, however you think, you are actually hacked by this whiteness. And when Macron went to Benin to restitute the throne of Benin, he did not went incognito. That's why I was very touched by the image of Ciraj with the national flag on the body. It's a deal between national state and national state. What Foucault said that the state will become racist. And this concerns me a lot. Because it's not a restitution towards the people, the Dan people, the Teke people, the Bakongo people, I know personally the grand-grandson of the King Gezo, who is since 37 years trying to get back the restitution of the throne of his ancestor. He never got an answer, ever. But since it became mediatic, and since Macron found another way to take over again in the market in Africa using this question of restitution, everyone is running, but nobody has contacted Prince Gezo. So your question is extremely relevant because we are navigating in so narrow things. I agree with you, it's difficult. Even when you read Houria Boutelja, that I invite you to read, the notion of whiteness is kind of, it's difficult. But I really feel that when an object is restituted to Benin or Senegal, it will be then at Dakar, Senegal, it will hand in the Théodore Monod Museum, where the director Malik Diaye will put it in a vitrine, and on the label they will add object from the Dogon, restituted by France, this date, blah, 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 blah. And this makes that the ritual, for me, has been hacked, the object is hacked, and then carry many things. It's not only the name and the event, it carries other things. And as Souleymane Bachir Diagne told me, the question of return, of this sort of fantasy of the origin, the purity, is actually tricked here. The real owner either do not exist anymore, but they are not the state. The only representation that the state is offering them is a mimic of colonialism, a museum. I hope I answered your question.
I also would like to add, because I think it's a very interesting point, but on the other side, and actually go again on that line that I try to expose, I think it's really necessary to look that past that is now, we talk about in the present, like the question of restitution, and what's going on in the present moment. And I think they really work together. So maybe the museums in the European, in this whiteness regime, it's actually now ready to make this restitution because it's also connected with the nation state. They are all part of the nation state, and they will gain points. This is true. Because always will be this, we not even killed and rob and steal, but we also have this big power we can also return. And in this way, but on the other side, what is very interesting is that this space of Europe is really poisoning, and including Austria very centrally, that certain institutions, national institutions, are into this business, and they actually negotiate. It's a whole long, years and years going process. On the other side, institutions of education, as I said, that were before seen as autonomous, they are today actually on one hand is given, on the other side is taken. So they now are in this function, I will say, of cleansing, of actually being the fortress in terms that the police and other administration, the laws, simply is taking all these big myths of the freedom, autonomy, and so on, and on the other side you have thousands of people who are actually here, asylants, refugees, not to speak of second and third generation of migrants that are actually citizens. They are not migrants anymore in a certain way, who are actually all the time under unbelievable pressure, and this pressure is not just violence, but is actually connected with practically being put on the verge to lose your life, to be deported nowhere, and actually to lose years and years of being in Europe or Austria. That is also something. Who will repay them? Who will repay a student 8 years in Vienna who is now onto the verge to be deported? 8 years of nothing. So this is, I think, something that we should think very, very seriously and together. These are not processes that are just distanced. Okay.
I appreciate your point tremendously. I think it needs to be taken extremely seriously. There are other presumptions of how the modeling and the imagination of returns will take place. You will know that in Dakar, we've had the opening of a grand new monumental museum. In Algeria or Tunisia, right now we have a grand African Union project making the Grand Museum of Africa. Right? So there is an idea that you will have a return that reproduces the problem of the way the artwork or the object is curated and held and imprisoned and entrapped. Now, what is the task of the museum in this question? And we need to put on the agenda a new concept of the museum, without which restitution will fail. And it is one of the most important tasks that we have to do, to imagine what this new museum. There are some projects that are giving us answers in which we have to think outside of a conservation-based concept of the museum that is trapped in disciplines. And if you bring an object from an ethnographic museum in Europe into an ethnographic museum in an African society, you reproduce all of the problems of colonization. So we need to, and there are some answers here and there in the debates that we are having. You cannot have a holus bolus answer for every colonialism. South Africa is characterized by multiple colonialisms, including that which is a colonialism over Namibia, and a kind of regional force that has resulted in certain kinds of patterns of collecting. It makes South Africa very interesting as being, in a sense, colonized and colonizer. A society like Austria might not have had a formal colonialism on the African continent, but it is so deeply marked by colonialism that it gives special tasks to us. And so there is so much work that we have to do, and it's going to take resources. And that is our responsibility of our generation, or let me say, of your generation.
Dorcy, une question?
Okay. Yes, I have just a quick question about the museum, and this question of the return of artifacts, including human remains, very interesting. But what do you think about the transformation now going on in European museum from somehow colonial museum to something new? The project of Humboldt Forum, for example, in Berlin, and we have one very good example in Brussels with the Museum ter Vuren, who was previously a colonial museum, maybe the last colonial museum in Europe. And now they transformed the museum in something somehow new, called Museum of Africa. They changed somehow the narrative. They don't talk about primitive, they say art premier, which means the same, but it's more elegant. And personally, I preferred the previous museum because it was really clear. It was the museum not of Africa, but a museum of colonialism. It was possible to see there what was the narrative of colonialism, to see Leopold II is everywhere, and everything turned around him. It's like to be in a dictatorship in the museum. You have the dictator is big, like a god, and the subject. Now we have this new museum with somehow a progressive view, but it's still in the same building, built by the blood of Congolese people. The image of Leopold II is everywhere. There are statues. It's impossible to clean the museum. And there is still human remains in the museum. There is one of the king of Congo, Lusinga. His head is still in the museum. And my question is it possible to decolonize a colonial institution? This is my first question. Maybe, and my second is it not worst what is arriving now with this new kind of museum?
Oh, yeah, and then you have. I think, Dorothy, you've already preempted my my question as well, but I'll pose it again. And I first want to thank Kader and Ciraj for your presentations. I thought they were just wonderful the way they spoke to each other and raised all kinds of really interesting epistemic questions. But I am with Dorothy. It seems to me that the question that you're struggling with is whether the museum as such can be decolonized, correct? And has it ever been raised, the question of like, if a restituted object is going to be put on display, what kind of restitution is it? Why is it that we put these objects on display? What is it that we want people to sort of see and recognize and understand? But is there something about the display itself that is problematic? And the reason I'm asking this is because it seems to me that the whole, and this is just an intervention that you can either sort of accept or not, what troubles me about the politics of restitution is the way in which it seems to reproduce a very humanist understanding of the subject, right? So the ideas of the subject as one, you know, as a national citizen, bearing rights, who has a right to property, so the idea of private property. You talked in terms of origin, but I think it's also about property, right? And above all, the really controversial idea of dignity, right? Which I think has been sort of called into question. Like, what do we mean by human dignity? And is dignity something that is a concept that is sort of, you know, has certain kinds of, you know, ontological roots that cannot really be translated into other sorts of contexts, you know? So I'm thinking, I guess, of what's in the back of my mind is, I don't know if you folks are aware of Giorgio Agamben's book, The Remnants of Auschwitz, where he questions, maybe you're aware of this book, where he questions the idea of dignity as the basis of ethics. You know, so what is the ethical thing to do here? You know, what is the ethics of restitution? So it's not just the politics of restitution, but the ethics of restitution, and the kinds of, you know, assumptions we're making about what is the ontology of the modern subject in the so-called third world. I mean, is the passport to modernity fundamentally through these claims to humanistic understandings of dignity and private property and the national citizen and so on and so forth? So what if the restituted object were never put on display? What changes then? Is that something that can be entertained?
I start with the answer, then I give you the mic. To Dorothy first, which I think how to decolonial colonial museum. It's, I mean, referring to what I was saying before, I would not say, and I would not use anymore this decolonial word. Please kill me if I'm using it again. Unlearning is very important. I think we definitely need to unlearn from those certainties that we've been hacked. And I mean, you know, I worked at Tervuren for the Documenta project in 2012 in the storages. And in 2012, when I opened one armory and I found almost 54 Songin kisses, one after the other, and I lived in Lubumbashi. I mean, I said to the guy, oh wow, you have so many objects. First, you don't show them, and then it's a bit obscene. They almost fired me in 2012. Recently, I was in Belgium last Christmas, whatever, and I thought, oh, I'm going to look at this renovation of the Tervuren Museum to see whether they unlearn a little bit. And it was, for me, exactly as you said, even worse. I think the question of restitution in the light of colonialism is the question of, again, dehumanizing the others, to de-responsibilize, creating what Karim Al-Azali called the non-lieu. It did not happen. Denying what did happen. And I think that, to be honest, for me, since the beginning, I found that the question of restitution reproduced the universalist soup that colonialism has been spreading all around. So when I hear that, referring to what Ciraj said before, the Algerian Museum, in 2009, I was with Jalila Rahlir, director of the cabinet of Khalida Toumi, the former Ministry of Culture in Algiers, and we talk about artifacts, and Jalila told me, you know that here in Algiers we have one of the most incredible collection of artifacts. I said, how come? I mean, I've never heard about that. She said, we have the collection of Savorgnan de Brazza. Because Savorgnan de Brazza died in Algiers from yellow fever. He was completely fired by the French after he gave them the Congo. And when he died, when he passed away, his collection of artifacts, huge one, stayed there. At the independence, the French, in the agreement of Evian, they took all this sort of romantic and impressionist painting and orientalist painting. And when the Algerians said, okay, what do you want to take this collection? They said, we don't need that African stuff. So in 1963, a year after the Algerian Revolution, there was an African Union meeting in Algiers. And all the very young Ministry of Cultures were talking about this collection. The Algerians said, okay, you from Gambia, you from Ivory Coast, you from Rwanda, take your object, take the object that belongs to your country. And the whole African Ministry of Culture said, no, leave them here. But with the idea, they all agreed, they signed a document, that Algeria would build the Museum of Africa. And as you know, in Algeria, everything takes time. Even I tell you the story of 2009, and now I heard by fellow Insar actually. He told me that, no, it's true, they showed us the place. So the question behind this is, going back to this question and your question, is, okay, I heard that also beautiful other story. Niemeyer has signed a building, has signed a project before he died, because he built 3 buildings in Algeria. But behind him, why do we need to mimic what has been done? Why do we need a museum, another museum? And for me, I will hand on that, because I'm working on a film on restitution for a year and a half. I have interviewed a Greek archaeologist on the question of the marble of the Parthenon, on top of a building from, it was at the end of the day, and back there was the Parthenon, the Acropole, sorry, or Parthenon. And I was asking him, after hours of interviews, what do you think about the restitution, about these British issues and Greece? You know what he did answer to me? After a long discourse, this old archaeologist who was also explaining how much the Greek state has used this to hijack to avoid the real economical problem, and he became a nationalist, a national narrative, etc., the question of restitution of the marble. He said, you know, in the end, we would like that the British tells us, okay, here are the marble, your marble, take them. Just to answer them, we don't need them anymore. And I think this answer he gave me, we don't want them anymore. I found this so interesting.
As an African brought in from time to Europe to museum debates in Germany, Stuttgart, Dresden, Berlin, Cologne, and as someone who has spent many years working in Tervuren, and who has observed the evolution of that process from the debate around the Jean-Luc Velout exhibition, the Hochschild critique, and then you have this methodology of making a museum that completely disempowered the curators. And where a museum has been launched at a time when the entire field has outstripped what it is at its birth. And so it is just an unbelievable shame and a waste of money that this museum was created, that is still frozen in all of the categories that entrapped the previous museum. And where you see it most dramatically is in the way it deals with nature as a completely, as a category that's not made by culture. So, I mean, Tervuren was extremely disappointing when I saw it at the opening. Of course, we have a problem emerging in Berlin, and we've been discussing it now for years. And I think our German colleagues are extremely fortunate that they have an active civil society. You have Berlin Postkolonial, and you have scholars who have been engaging this for a number of years, and artists. And and I've been a participant in advisory meetings, and unfortunately, the leaders of that project do not listen. They do not listen to the advice that they get, because all of their objectives and all of their desires were cast in stone from the very beginning, from the whole concept of a Schloss, of the desire for a 19th century history that is untainted by the difficult 20th century. And, ultimately, the Humboldt Forum is a move in which Germany is making itself European, because its Europeanness for me is not certain, that it is a society formed by being communist. And so this is the assertion of Germany as a European society, and also out of time. But our German colleagues they are making strides every day. They have desks that are doing interesting work. They have provenance research that is on the go. They have been meeting in Vienna today as we have been speaking, and all of the colleagues are here as we speak. It's an extremely contested society, and our task is to advance those contests and to make sure that we put our desires into those debates. And I think that is what our responsibility is.
I just heard by Anna that we have to leave now. So thank you very much. And I would like to leave Marina talking, but